The International Court of Justice in Hague has begun a two-day hearing in South Africa's case against Israel, where South Africa is accusing Israel of genocide against the people of Palestine. Israel has denied the allegation, calling it baseless and bloody liable. South Africa will argue the case today. Israel will respond on Friday. South Africa has presented an 84-page statement and has requested that Israel be directed immediately to suspend its military operation in Gaza. South Africa alleges that, and I'm quoting here, Israel has engaged in, is engaging in, and risks further engaging in genocidal acts against the Palestinian people in Gaza, end quote. Now, the current hearing will exclusively be held only to decide whether the International Court of Justice has the jurisdiction to decide on this case at all, and whether South Africa's case is strong enough for an emergency order to, and I'm quoting again, protect against further severe and irreparable harm to the Palestinians in Gaza. Of course, the final ruling on whether or not it's genocide could take years, and South Africa's argument is that people in Gaza don't have that kind of time. I'll give you an example. In 2019, a case brought by Gambia against Myanmar on their crackdown of Rohingyas is still in trial 4 years later. Now, as the World Court begins its proceedings in Gaza, Hamas continues to hold hostages. Israel continues its bombing. Let me give you first an update of everything that has happened so far in Gaza very quickly as we look at the numbers. Now, the war began on the 7th of October. We are now in January. In Gaza, 23,000 Palestinians have died, of which 10,000 children alone. 7,000 children are said to be missing under the rubble of buildings that have come down. According to data that's coming out right now, more than 10 children on an average every day have lost at least one limb to the bombing in Gaza. Children that do survive are facing the prospect of starvation. A United Nations report recently said that 90% of the population is facing acute food insecurity, and there is virtually all households at this point are skipping meals. There is a lack of clean drinking water and a lack of sanitation that has led to an outbreak of infectious diseases. Children are particularly vulnerable to it. United Nations humanitarian chief Martin Griffiths has described Gaza as simply uninhabitable. Catherine Russell, the executive director of UNICEF, in November warned that Gaza is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. This month, she said the children in Gaza are caught in a nightmare that worsens every day. Save the Children has alleged that Israel is now using starvation as a method of warfare. Children are being treated for amputations without anesthesia. A nurse in Al-Shifa Hospital has been quoted saying that sometimes they have to give children gauze to bite down on to manage the pain because they simply don't have painkillers to give them. UNICEF has said there are over 1 lakh breastfeeding mothers in Gaza who are unable to feed themselves and therefore cannot feed their children. And there is no formula or milk powder available anywhere in Gaza because of the siege, and there are no supplies coming in, and so newborn babies right now are starving as well. According to the United Nations, 180 women are giving birth in Gaza on a daily basis. They're having C-sections without any anesthesia either. Doctors Without Borders have said that doctors are being arrested and detained. Healthcare workers are being taken to undisclosed locations and being interrogated by the Israeli military. As of the 5th of December, 250 healthcare workers have been killed. The head of plastic surgery at the burn unit at Khan Yunis Hospital has been operating day and night and has said the hospital is grossly overcrowded. Patients are being kept on the floor, which is not clean. The emergency department is overcrowded. There's a severe shortage of healthcare workers, fuel, water, medicines, and food. Dr. Deborah Harrington, who is an OBGYN from the UK who was operating in a British charity hospital in Gaza, was forced to return to the UK, said that they witnessed horrific and challenging conditions. She's been quoted, and I'll put out a trigger warning before I read this out. I'm quoting her. She says, "I can't get it out of my mind. A child came in alive, literally burnt to the bone. The hands were contracting, the face was charcoal, they were alive and they were talking, and we had no morphine." End quote. Hospitals and schools are being regularly targeted and attacked. The healthcare sector is on the brink of collapse. A third of Gaza's hospitals are not functioning at all, if at all functioning in a really small way. WHO says hospitals in northern Gaza are completely out of service. The WHO Director General had earlier this week said that his staff witnessed sickening scenes of people of all ages being treated on the floor, blood-streaked floor of hospitals and chaotic corridors. Reporters Without Borders have said that journalism is in the process of being eradicated within the Gaza Strip as a result of Israel's refusal to pay heed to calls to protect media personnel. The Committee for Protection of Journalists, primarily its investigations as of the 10th of January, have shown that 79 journalists and media workers were confirmed dead, 72 Palestinian, 4 Israeli and 3 Lebanese. There is a desperate shortage of food, water, sanitation and medication. The Deputy Executive Director of the World Food Programme has said that law and order will break down. In any meaningful humanitarian operation is completely impossible. Food supply is too little. There is no fuel distribution. Communications are down. There's no security for staff of these organizations. They simply cannot do their job. Now let's take a look at international law and what international law says. Now, international law are the accepted rules of armed conflict that emerged from the Geneva Conventions. And they say this: 1. Directly targeting civilians is strictly forbidden. Attacking hospitals, medical units, healthcare workers is strictly forbidden, and this protection extends to the wounded and the sick and the staff of these establishments and ambulances. Attacking journalists is strictly prohibited. Intentionally attacking personnel and material involved in humanitarian assistance is a separate war crime. Sieging an entire area and blockading it is considered a war crime if civilians are being denied food, water, electricity, which is also happening. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has been quoted repeatedly saying, and I'm quoting him here again, "I am deeply concerned about the clear violations of international humanitarian law we are witnessing in Gaza." He said, "Let me be clear, no party in an armed conflict is above international humanitarian law." UN experts say Israel's siege and bombardment constitutes collective punishment, where basically you punish an entire population of people for the crimes of a few. Harming of a person or a group of people based on the actions of a few is against the Geneva Convention. Now let's take a look at the court that is actually hearing this case. The International Court of Justice is located in Hague in Netherlands. It is the highest judiciary body of the UN, and it settles legal disputes between countries in accordance with international law, provided these countries have already accepted and become part of this system. The UN General Assembly and the Security Council elect the court's 15 judges for 9-year terms. Now, its president is currently Joan Donoghue, former legal advisor to the State Department of the US. There's also an Indian judge on the panel, Judge Dalveer Bhandari, who previously served on the Supreme Court of India as a judge, and Bombay High Court Chief Justice. Now, the International Court of Justice can decide cases brought before it by states that consent to its jurisdiction. So both South Africa and Israel are parties to the International Court of Justice. The court's rulings are legally binding, but enforcing those can be tricky, and they could also be ignored. For example, Russia has rejected the 2022 order calling it to cease its war against Ukraine. What is South Africa's case against Israel? This is what South Africa is arguing. It's filed its case on the 29th of December. It accuses Israel of intending, and this is an important word, to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as part of a broader Palestinian national, racial, and ethnic group. It accuses Israel of violating the Geneva Convention. It points to large-scale bombing, maiming of civilians, mass displacement, and deprivation of access to adequate food and water. South Africa accuses Israel of preventing Palestinian births by displacing pregnant women and denying them access to basic necessities and killing them. South Africa will essentially have to show that Israel intends to wipe out not just Hamas but also the Palestinians in order to win this case. And to do so, Israeli leaders calling for mass expulsions from Gaza or denying anyone there is innocent is part of South Africa's case. So what is Israel's defense? Israel, like I have said, has denied all of his charges. The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said, and I'm quoting in here, he said, "No, South Africa, it is not we who have perpetrated genocide, it is Hamas. Hamas would murder all of us if it could." In contrast, the Israeli Defense Forces is acting as morally possible, end quote. Now, the key contention in Israel's aim to completely wipe out Hamas and not the Palestinian people, they have pointed out that they've taken several measures to avoid civilian casualties. What are these measures? Airdropping flyers, warning people of attacks, telling them to leave that neighborhood, calling civilians on their phones, urging them to leave targeted buildings, and aborting some strikes if civilians are in the way. Now, the arguments here against Israel's defense is that communications have been down, so the argument that you could call someone on their phone and tell them to evacuate doesn't always work. A lot of times, civilians have been asked to move to what they were called safer neighborhoods, and then those safer neighborhoods were attacked as well. And so no space has been left really safe inside of Gaza. But really what we need to look at right now is the internationally accepted definition of genocide. According to the Geneva Convention, which came into force in 1951, genocide means the following acts are committed with the intention to destroy, in whole or in part, an ethnical, racial, religious, or national group. And there's a list of things: killing the members of the group, causing serious body and mental harm, inflicting on the group conditions where life will be difficult, forcibly transferring children from one group to another group. Now, the most important part, and I pointed this out earlier as well, is the word intent. Was it intentional to do all of these things? Now, if we take a look at the list, all of these things are happening in Gaza, but intent is what South Africa is going to have to prove in order to win this case and constitute what is happening in Gaza as a genocide, which means that Israel, it needs to prove that Israel intentionally is destroying the people of Gaza. Again, some of the arguments being placed before the court, as we heard South Africa argue, was the fact that Israeli ministers on public platforms have gone out to say that Gaza needs to be wiped out, that referred to the people of Gaza as human animals, have called them terrorists, the targeting of schools and hospitals, the fact that 10,000 children are dead, and they've repeatedly referred to these children as collateral damage, saying that we don't want to target them, but they're in the way and they're being used as human shields by Hamas. Now, the argument that is being put forth, and this is perhaps something that all of us can also maybe consider if we want to understand how this is playing out. If they were terrorists hiding in a mall or a school or a hospital in one of our cities where we live, would we be comfortable with the government just bombing the building and calling everybody in that building collateral damage? That is effectively what is happening in Gaza. Remember, the largest hospital in Gaza, Al-Shifa Hospital, was evacuated and bombed while there were patients still in it, where doctors were still operating, because Israel said that it was convinced that Hamas in the tunnels underneath that hospital was operating its headquarters. And after everything happened, Israel has not effectively displayed any evidence, of those Hamas headquarters that it was going after. And so there is a gaping hole here in what is being said and what has actually been proven, and what evidence is being put out. The other question, of course, is the narrative of the Western media. The question to ask is this: 10,000 children dead. If these children were white or in the Western world, would there be this much silence around their death? Israel has repeatedly said it needs to destroy Hamas completely and destroy Hamas's infrastructure completely. in self-defense in order to protect itself. But how is denying food and water and medicine to children and to pregnant women and to people who are desperately wounded, how is this in self-defense? These are questions that are going to come up in this case as it continues and as we hear Israel's defense in the International Court of Justice.